Feldman. So good to have so many of you share your lunch and learn session with us. My name is Scott Vaughn. I am the host for today's lunch and learn session on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta. Working behind the scenes with me doing tech support is Shanna Shawtuzzi, and she's also with Board Leadership Alberta. Who is Board Leadership Alberta? Well, Board Leadership Alberta is a collaboration of representatives of Board Leadership Lethbridge, Board Leadership Southeast Alberta, and also Board Leadership Edmonton. Many of you have attended a board leadership training event in Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, and Edmonton in the past that was coordinated by one of these board leadership committees. And they have proven to be very popular and well attended over the past number of years by many not-for-profit board members and staff in Alberta. So Board Leadership Alberta consists of representatives from each of these committees with a shared purpose. You want to provide relevant, accessible online training for not-for-profit organizations across all of Alberta. So this Board Leadership Alberta initiative is an extension of that training of each of these committees, working together collaboratively on this specific project, this set of lunch and learn sessions. And on the screen now, you can see all of the organizations that have representatives on the board leaderships I identified before, as well as they support this Board Leadership Alberta initiative. We thank each of these organizations for their support of Board Leadership Alberta, the individual board leadership training events in Edmonton, Medicine Hat, and Lethbridge, as well as your support for not-for-profit groups and organizations in your community. I'd like to also take a moment right now to recognize that we are on the traditional and ancestral homeland of many diverse people in Alberta, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose ancestors have walked and stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize our role as settlers on this land, and we're grateful to work, live, and learn on this traditional territory. We're located all across Alberta, acknowledge the land of many peoples presently associated with Treaties 6, 7, and 8. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude. And also a reminder of tomorrow, September 30th, we mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a time to honor First Nations, Métis, and Inuit survivors of residential schools, as well as their families, communities, and those who sadly do not make it home. I'd like to take a note about the chat box feature you have in Zoom. We'll be placing a number of information links in the chat box throughout the lunch hour. And it's a place that you can ask questions as well with our speaker today. Please keep in mind, though, this is a public chat box, so please provide your thoughts and comments with that consideration. Just a note on questions to the speaker. You can ask the question at any time. We'll try to endeavor to pick up some of the questions as we go, but we'll also maybe pick them up at the end at the Q&A at the end of the session as well. And if there are a lot of questions, we'll even, David has agreed to even go a few more minutes if we need it to even pick up a few more questions in case we can't get to them all in the short hour period that we have right now. So that's the plan for the day around the questions. Well, as you can see, we are here for appreciative policy making, policies that work. And the link to register for the final lunch and learn session next Thursday is strategies for boards engaging in a changing environment. That's a panel session that we have with Jason Apino, Sherry Hansen, and Jennifer Baer. And there's going to be a link in the chat box coming up real quickly here with that session that you can register for that session. And it's the same way that you registered for this one, it's how you do it for that one. It's free of charge. Please note that all the lunch and learn sessions are going to be recorded and available on the Board Leadership Alberta YouTube channel after. The YouTube link is also going to be put in the chat box. And as a bonus right now, you can see last year's Lunch and Learn webinars, as well as the Strengthening Board Decision-Making session with Jennifer Baer last week. And of course, the upcoming sessions will be added as we go. So I'm right now very, very excited on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta Committee to introduce the speaker of our second Lunch and Learn session this fall, Appreciative Policy Making, Policies at Work, Mr. David Feldman. David Feldman is the Director of Learning and Development at the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations. His portfolio includes the governance and one-on-one services for the nonprofit sector in Edmonton and Greater Region. David holds a Bachelor of Science in Mathematical Sciences with a psychology minor, a Master's in Interdisciplinary Studies, Collective Cognition, and a PMP, Project Management Professional. as well as a QMed, qualified mediator. David has worked with nonprofit project management advisory and family business boards for nearly 20 years. As a private consultant, David had the opportunity to work with nonprofits across all stages of their life cycles. He has supported nonprofits through challenges, helped them navigate crisis situations, and inspired them to redefine success. As a mediator, David has supported boards through some of their toughest moments. He continues to help passionate, caring people find common ground, unite around shared visions, and ultimately move forward. I'm now very pleased to turn it over to the very knowledgeable and capable hands of David Feldman. All yours, David.
Thanks, Scott. I hope I'm not the only one who gets really, really uncomfortable when somebody reads their bio and thinks, man, why did I let that get shared? And I should just hide from it. So let's, there we go. Let me just make sure my screen is sharing properly for everybody, and
yeah,
let's go forward.
Yeah.
Perfect. All good?
Sharing good. Yep.
Awesome. So today's interesting for me because normally this is a 3-hour workshop, and I'm going to try to condense it in a way that makes sense, that works, and that connects with everybody. Appreciative policy writing really comes from its heart in appreciative inquiry. So for those of you who are familiar with AI is a framework of really trying to find the best of what our organization can be, where we are, and create that as our model to move forward. The idea being that organizations move in the direction of what's evaluated. We've heard that a lot throughout the years, things like results-based budgeting. Based on your results, here's the outcomes, let's move things forward. And AI has kind of stepped back and said, but is that really what you're evaluating? Are you evaluating the right thing? So let's start with the appreciative state. What is the best of the people in the world that we like, that drives us, that brings value to us, that really makes us thrive and want to be here? And our inquiry is the act of exploration and discovery. Let's question that, let's explore it, let's dive deeper into it. And what we want to do is kind of bring that into how we shape policies and into why we shape our policies that way. So before we talk about policy writing, we need to talk about, and the policies for our organization, we need to talk about our organizations themselves and what makes an organization healthy. Healthy organizational health is primarily composed of 3 key components: leadership, culture, and those policies. For good leadership in that organizational health, we're looking for consistent and predictable behavior from those in charge. We want them to lead by example, and we want them to embody the values of our organization. The culture is about the way we behave and live. Hopefully it's positive and healthy. Part of that is calling out and addressing behaviors that's not part of our norm. If you work in a culture where you don't call out behavior and don't address behavior that isn't part of your norm, then that behavior is part of your norm. It's acceptable. That's the message we're giving. And that most importantly, that the behavior matches the stated experience. If we want to talk about having a culture like X, but it actually doesn't feel that way, then we've got a problem with our culture. Policies are the codification of the desired leadership and culture. They're where we put them down, we express them, we communicate them to each other. They need to match that leadership. They need to match the stated desired outcomes, future focused, and embody the values of our organization. You'll hear me talk about values a lot. So what embodies the values of the organization that we need? It means that I should be able to trust them. They should be consistent, that I should know what to expect. And what happens is trust has created this very interesting misalignment in our world. We had the 80s and 90s had a lot of this, trust, the speed of trust. We need trust in the workplace. We know that teams to trust each other are more effective. But what happened was, this was the kind of trust we were talking about. We were talking about behavioral-based trust. Behavioral-based trust is me being able to trust to expect what you're going to do. I trust that I can predict your behavior. I trust that when I'm doing this falling backwards exercise and our boss is over there, it doesn't matter if you hate me or not, you're going to catch me. Versus values-based trust. I don't know about everybody else in the room. I grew up on this. This was my definition of trust as a child. where a strange person shows up at a teenager's room on a flying carpet that you know nothing about them and says, hey, do you trust me? And for some reason they said yes. And as a parent now, I think this is absolutely crazy. But at the same time, we trusted and we wanted to trust Aladdin because it wasn't that we knew what he was going to do. It's that we had seen him before and we knew his values. We watched him take care of others. We watched him step in to rescue somebody. We saw him as a person who cared. And so that's really the trust we're talking about and why policies are important. And there's a difference between knowing what to expect from someone and knowing why someone behaves in a specific way. The why is what's important because the circumstances might change and the behavior might need to change. But if I know why you're behaving, what's driving those decisions, then I have faith in the outcome and your behavior, even if I don't understand it. And so when we think about that in our policies, we've got management style policies and governance generative style policies. We have those that are about control and reactionary things that happen. We need to create rules around them. And then we have those that are about the future, about helping us be who we want when the circumstances change. Most of the time, when I work with boards, organizations, their policies were written because something happened. Somebody stole from petty cash, therefore we need a policy around petty cash. We saw this a lot, and I'll talk about this example more in detail, social media. How many organizations, and I'd love to see, if you can hit your reaction, one of the reaction emojis, wrote a Facebook policy or a Twitter policy. And we're having conversations of should we, as on the board level, be on these platforms? Rather than a policy about how is our communication going to be, how do we want to present ourselves, how do we respond, and allowing the staff to adjust and work forward in that space. So what can policies do? They can direct actions and activities, influence who is hired, influence staff and volunteer retention, protect the staff, the organization, and the board, hold people in the organization accountable, and keep the organization true to its purpose to the community. Great, simple, but how do we make them? What does that mean? How do we actually write them? Because this is where the barrier really gets in, is we need some policies done. We don't know what's the best way to make them. Somebody who feels a little bit comfortable says, sure, I'll do them. And they go away and they write some stuff and we approve it. And then later we realize that those policies don't actually work for us. So instead, let's flip the narrative. Let's flip the conversation and say, what is it we should be doing before we even start putting things down, putting pen on paper down? So step one is about controlling the time frame. Sounds simple. It's one of those things that we would think we do naturally, and yet we don't. This is what I mean by that. When we look at the time of the time frame when we're writing policies, what issue are we trying to address, and where do we sit in it? Are we asking the right question? One of my favorite books is called The More Beautiful Question, and what it's about is this idea of when we're stuck on something, is the question we've asked ourselves that we're probably trying to solve the right one? Or is that where we're trapped? Is it the question that's the problem? And that can we reframe it? Can we reimagine it? Can we re-explore it? And so when we talk about appreciative policy writing, what we really want to do is step back and say, all right, something's happened, or for some reason we're thinking about something, but is the thing we're trying to write the policy about because of that event? Or is it about the future and what that looks like? I mentioned petty cash example earlier. I've sat at that board table where somebody says, one of our employees stole from us. We need a policy about employee theft. And everybody starts talking about how you lock up the cash and what you do here, what you do that. And the truth is, if somebody wants to steal, they'll find a way to steal from you. The reverse of that question is, how do we create an environment where the staff who need support, the staff who feel underappreciated, the staff who are going through financial difficulties don't feel like they need to steal from the organization? And so they don't. Instead, they feel supported by the organization. What does that look like for us? So rather than writing to prevent what happened already, how do we create a policy to help us shape who we want to be so those things don't need to happen? Right? We know the number one reason that employees steal office supplies or from the office is because they feel undervalued in their roles. We know that one of the next coming reasons for that is that they feel that they're in a current financial strain and are needing support and they don't know where to go for it. And so organizations that have addressed those two issues by finding ways to give advances, by creating employment and compensation models that work, have less, significantly less, employee-based theft. There are different ways of thinking about the same problem. Once we've framed it, now we need to make sure that it aligns with us. So do you have your mission? Do you have your vision, right? Our vision is the world we want to create. Does what we're working, how do we make sure that we keep that top of mind, that this policy helps us be part of that? You know, we don't want to create rules in our organization where our staff, our volunteers, our board members feel different than the type of environment we want to create. So a mentorship organization that creates rules that don't allow staff to feel like they can come and ask questions, to feel like they're being mentored, to feel like they're growing, contradicts those pieces. Our mission is our work in doing that. Let's make sure they align with that. But on top of that, the part that we often forget is our values. Some of us have organizational values. It makes it easy. But does that mean those are the values that are questioned when we're talking about this policy? Now, we should never contradict our organizational values. They're the values that drive everything we do. But when we're coming here and we're sitting here to talk about a communications policy, what are the principles that we're not willing to bend on that we stand for? And as I was thinking about this, I really started, I couldn't help but think about the quote from the musical Hamilton, where Hamilton turns to Burr and he says, "If you stand for nothing, Burr, what do you fall for?" And that's part of this conversation here, is in order for us to know what this policy is supposed to do and what this policy stands for, we also need to know what it doesn't stand for. And we often enter into these conversations where, you know, do you want your communications policy to be about taking risks or about being safe? Do you want it to be about giving and sharing information, us giving out to others, or is it about us getting things like donations? What does that look like? And the answer so common is, well, I want both. And the truth is, when we say both, we're often not good at either. And it tends to cause a lot of problems, and it tends to cause a lot of conflict and clarity. And yes, we don't have to say all the values out there and what does that look like, but we need to know what we stand for and what we don't. What values matter to us and what values don't matter to us when it comes to this policy. So I've included, and I know this image is hard to read, but it is in the handout as well. I don't know if the handout's available to everybody or not right now. I posted it earlier in the chat, so we'll make sure it's up there again if it needs to be posted again. This is the Schwartz theory of universal values. So this chart has been now used around the world. It's used quite often in Europe to test the changing values of Europe, but that's not why I've posted it here. Why I've posted it here is because it's a circle model. There's 10 major categories for the values, but the smaller words kind of give you more detail and help you understand. But what's important is that things that are opposite from each other from the middle are actually opposing values and contradict each other. So in the broader sense, universalism and benevolence contradict things like personal achievement and power. Self-direction versus conformity and tradition. And so this is here to give you a tool to say, you know, when I think about what we're working on, I really shouldn't have a space where I've said that both, you know, something in the universalism category and something in the power category are my top two things, because those two pieces, those two values, those two things that drive us are actually completely opposed to each other. And that the act of going for one versus the other puts us into conflict. So, clarity. We've talked about our timeline. We've talked about our values and what we stand for. Let's talk about clarity in a policy. What is the change we're trying to make? Can we articulate that to each other? I mentioned earlier the example of, yeah, I'll go write a policy on that. I leave the board meeting, I bring something at the next meeting. Did I know the right thing and right intent before I went and wrote this policy? Did I ask the right questions? Did I check in with my board about what we're actually trying to accomplish, that I know that we're all on the same page? Why are we writing this? What are we actually trying to change? What were we trying to do by having this in place? What are we hoping that it will actually do? These things are going to matter for us. And so I need to ask those questions of my board before I even start or restart. And as we write, we need to make sure that we have clarity in those pieces. What the words I use make sense to me. That doesn't mean they make sense to you. There are some things that really, on a deeper level, the same word can mean something completely different to people on different ends of the political spectrum. We're a wonderfully multicultural country, so from different places, from different lands, from different languages, are we clarifying those things? We need to predetermine how specific we need to be for that. We need to make sure that we give the details required for those who come after us to understand. And I think that's the piece that really matters. It's not about this board understanding the policy. It's not about this staff understanding the policy. It's about all of us and those to come after us understanding the policy. So I'm going to ask everybody to participate. I'm hoping to get a little bit of participation, and I'm going to ask Scott to be my guinea pig, assuming that he's going to be brave on this one. I've got 2 images coming up. So Scott, I'm going to put on you so that everybody else doesn't have to unmute. But if others can post in the chat the first thing they see when they see this image, and if you can just declare to us what you see when you see the next image, that would be great. So you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Yeah.
Scott,
All right. I see a beautiful girl.
So I'm going to give the chat a little bit seconds. For those who are saying lady, what age? So I'm seeing different answers in the chat. And I think that's important. It's one of the reasons I love this picture. 35, awesome, I love it. So we're seeing some young women, we're seeing some elderly women comments in the chat. Connie, yeah, young girl first, then old woman, then I think. So here's the question, can anybody see both at the exact same time?
It's really hard to see both at the exact same time, for sure.
You can flip back and forth between them, right? And if you can flip back and forth in a heartbeat, but you can't, your brain can't read the 2 images simultaneously.
Yeah,
and I
very
like
much.
this because even if I know that they're both there, that doesn't mean I can see both perspectives at once. So what about this one?
Yeah, I see a bird, a type of bird there.
Do you see the other one yet?
Struggling to see the other picture yet on this one. Yes.
So we've got some in the chat who see it. There's a duck and a rabbit.
Oh, this the rabbit. Yes, there's the rabbit. Yeah.
And so this is really our piece about context. So one more. What do we see?
I see a bee.
And now?
12, 13, 14. B.Sc. Yeah, very
so
cool.
Context is king, right? And when we write our policies, we're in the middle of that context. We see them, we live them, we're breathing them. But the people who come after us aren't, right? And so I really want you to hold that as you think about this, because our world is through our worldview, our lens, our experience. Thank you to everybody who's posted. It's always nice to have some interaction. And I think that's one of the struggles always in the online space, is the that feel like you're not really connecting. These are some simple examples, and there's many fun ones out there on the internet, but I really like them for the conversation around, why do I need to define something? What definitions do I need to have? What definitions do I need to keep? Why am I having all these pieces that come after it? How important is something like is an organizational dictionary, right? Does it really matter? For those who work in government, you have 1,000,001 acronyms. For those who work in other spaces, you may or may not. But even then, you might be using the same thing to mean very different things as well. And so when we work into this space, it matters. I remember working with a lawyer once who we were having the debate of simple language versus legalese. And we both very much agreed that we want to keep things as simple as possible. But he was right when he said to me, the thing is that there are words that have very specific meaning in the legal framework. And just as the same as there's words that have very specific meaning in things like the Societies Act. And so when we use those words, we need to make sure that we're using them properly. And so the example in that case we're talking about was clear days. We were talking about bylaws and how many days between notice and the AGM. And he'd introduced me to the phrase of 21 clear days, which means it doesn't include the day of notice or the day of an event. And all of a sudden, that cleared up a lot of questions that I've been working with other groups on. What does 21 days mean? If I give notice today, does that mean there can be 19 days after today to one more? So there's 21 days total, or do I have to have space outside that? And that matters. But that also means that the people who come after me understand those words and understand what they mean. So rules are meaningless if they don't have a way to be enforced. And even when we're talking about the appreciative side, we still need to talk about what happens if the rule's not being followed. What does that look like? Why does that matter? And most important, what are we going to do about it? Enforcement's hard. How many organizations have something that says, if a board member misses 3 meetings, they can be voted off by the board? And of those who have that, how many of you have actually voted somebody off the board? And the number to that is always incredibly small. It feels uncomfortable. Do you want to be the person to bring up Heather's name and say, Heather's missed 3 meetings. I know that, they're going through a divorce right now and their kid is this and that, but I think we should kick them off the board because they missed their 3 meetings. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward. It puts you're the bad person to enact that way. And so instead, how do we create rules that enact themselves, that there's no decision-making step? There might be a check and balance later, but nobody has to be that person, that awkward one that enforces something. For enforcement, what we want is consistency. We want integrity. We want you to know that it meets your organization's values and who you are. We want it to help you keep your organization healthy, and most importantly, we want it to be legal. Make sure that it doesn't awkward. Make sure it doesn't allow for personal relationships to get in the way. You don't want it to impact your funding and community influence, right? You want it to stay healthy within the organization. We don't want to be airing out our dirty laundry. So I rushed through the first little bits so that I have time to actually spend with everybody and enacting it, because really the best way to learn is not having a talking head, but to try it out. So there was a link to the handouts. Near the end of the handouts, I believe it's the last 3 pages. There's a little bit of a tool in there to help you out and for us to kind of have the conversation. To make this easy, I'm going to pick a policy for us to work on. I'm going to pick a communications policy. They used to be a lot more, everybody was dealing with them. Now most of us have them, but it gives us a frame of mind and a frame of reference to kind of talk about it, to explore, and to try and actualize on it. When it comes to our communication, there's usually internal communication and external communication. To keep it easy, we're going to talk about external communication. And we might realize that we need more policies for your organization versus one generalized communication policy. Communication policies from an organization standpoint can be incredibly important. There's both how do we use our time and what mediums do we use? How do we present ourselves? What's our brand look like? But there's also things like, what can people say to the media? How do we protect ourselves from one of our staff accidentally saying something that causes slander, or those kind of pieces? And so there's a lot there that we need to address and to explore. And so let's keep it simple and higher level right now, but let's kind of take a dance and dive into this space. Because to me, what I want you to do is be able to walk away from today saying, okay, I've got some skills to start applying this and make it actually work. So our time frame: reactionary now, visionary. Are we writing a policy about a social media platform that exists today? So for example, how are we going to use Twitter? Should we use Twitter? Versus visionary is, what's our messaging going to be like? What's our identity going to be like? How do we want our message to come across? It doesn't matter what the medium is. It matters what our identity and presence is. Many of us in organizations years ago were in the reactionary space. We were making decisions about Facebook. We were making decisions about Twitter. We might be making decisions today about TikTok. I'm not sure. Is that really our decision, a decision the board needs to be making, or do we need to be saying, we want to make a policy about how we come across and who we reach and what our target audience is? So to get us started in that, your sheets have the value selected, why, and the value you chose against, just to make it a bit more interactive. I'm going to put up opposing values, opposing statements. If you're willing to engage and post them in the chat, that would be great. So what I'm going to ask is for you to pick one, and you'll see in a minute what I mean. So here's the first one. Do you believe that your organization's communication policy should be about getting it right or about getting it done? Thanks, Lynn. All right. Juliana, I'm going to push you on that one. Can you do both, or will you be paralyzed by it? So here's the struggle. Getting it right means that I might have 5 eyes look over it, or 3 eyes that look over it. I don't want any spelling mistakes. I don't want any grammar mistakes, that kind of things. Getting it done doesn't mean I don't want it to be good, but getting it done means that it's about getting it out. So if you chose get it right, I would tell you that you shouldn't be on something like Twitter. You shouldn't be in a space where it's about being responsive and engaging my community in real time. A newsletter is a much better approach for you. LinkedIn posts are much better. Things that we have time to curate and respond where we're releasing an organizational message. Getting it done is about being able to engage in real time, being able to get things out as they come into reality. And it's tough. It's hard to be, we want to be both. We always want to be both. But we can't be both if we want to engage well. You can't engage well on Twitter if you're in the get it right space. You'll never reply, you'll never engage and build your community. You might put posts up there, but you're not engaging with. And I meant to grab an example and I forgot, but for those who are interested, take a look at Wendy's Twitter profile, the restaurant Wendy's Twitter. They do an amazing job of engaging in real time with what's going on, mocking their competitors, having jokes and having fun, and they've built a huge following because of it. But it's not about getting it right. They take risks. Getting it right is that beautiful pamphlet we release as part of our annual report. And there are times where we make exceptions, like, yes, our annual report needs to be right, regardless of what our other comms looks like. But in our day-to-day communications, where we sit matters because it's how we build our audience. And I can tell you how many communications professionals talk to you that are going crazy because their bosses want both. Right? They want it to be out right away and they want it to be perfect. And if they respond quickly, they're not happy with the typos. And if they took too long, they're not happy with the timeline and they're trapped. So here's the next one. Is our communications about getting or giving? So giving is we're here to spread information. We're here to spread awareness. We're here to provide resources and training. We're here to give of our organization out. Getting is we're here to get engagement back. So I'll let people post for a sec, but the next one is risky or safe. Do we want to only use channels that are proven, tried and true, or are we willing to take risks? Are we willing to hop onto the newest social media craze, even though we don't know if it works for us or not? Or do we want to only use channels and mediums that we know are the best way to reach our audiences? A great example of this right now, for any organization that's trying to reach into the ethnocultural communities, is WhatsApp. Well, I think it's only 2% of Canadians use WhatsApp, and yet it's one of the #1 driving communication tools in other parts of the world. There is space there to use WhatsApp to reach out into those communities, but we traditionally don't use them. Transparent versus protective and private. How public are you willing to be on your communications? How much are you willing to talk about your staff and your clients and your work? How willing are you to share what's going on? And this might be a really important question for you to ask yourself about, do I work with vulnerable populations? So we should never share things about our clients. So we would never post photos of any of the events our clients are at. Versus we run a soccer program and it's okay to share those pictures. It's okay to share pictures from an event. Which one is it? And there's often another lens on this one too, which is about integrity. I was working with an organization that worked with individuals low income, and they were 100% against the media interviewing any of their clients or any photos. And one of their clients really wanted to be interviewed because they wanted to talk about the impact this organization did for them. And a board member was like, no, their privacy is on the line. And it was really interesting where another board member looked to them and said, but you're robbing them of their integrity by forcing them to keep their privacy. And so what does that mean? And that was a really interesting values conversation that took place there. So Samson posted, can we look at a guideline versus black and white policy? The answer is yes, but it's where are your boundaries and what does that guideline look like? That's the kind of conversation you need to have. Fake versus real. Is this about real things that are happening inside of our organization? Or is this our branded pretty picture we post all the time, right? And to keep us to the last one is cutting edge or proven. So as you kind of reflect on those, there's two parts to this. One is the word you chose, three parts. One is the word you chose. The other is the word you didn't choose. And the third is why. Because here's what's interesting. Just like those pictures can be seen differently by different people, people on the same board could have chosen the opposing words from each other, but for the exact same reason. Their intent might be the same. And the goal here is not the word. The goal here is the conversation and the clarity it builds for us in our understanding. So why did one board member choose transparent and the other one use protective? What were you trying to accomplish? What was the message you were trying to give? What is it you were hoping to do in that space? What does it mean for you? Let's have that conversation. And from there, can we find common ground? Because really, if this was about what one person wanted, I wouldn't need a whole board. We have a board and we have a committee and we have groups because it's about understanding that we all see the world differently. And we're all here to hold the values of our organization and to hold the values of our membership to make the best decision possible. And so it's these conversations that are really important. So let's talk about it. What values did you choose? Why didn't you choose them? Where are the common ground? What ones were really easy for us to pick? What ones were harder? And now let's come down and say, what are the 5 values that need to guide this policy or this policy category or whatever it is? What are the 5 values when it comes to communication we don't bend on, right? What does that look like for us? We might always need to look professional. That's not an option for us in this organization. We might always need to protect our clients. If we are a shelter, especially if we're a women's shelter, the privacy and the confidentiality of our clients and their safety is #1 in everything we do. And that is something we never risk in any of our communication, right? That's a very clear and easy line for us to understand and to work within. And let's make sure we're clear on those. We've talked about them. The conversation is what creates. the information you need to know. So we've had conversations about what we're trying to accomplish. We've had conversations about what values we stand for in this. But now let's make sure we're all on the same page. By writing this policy, what is the change or impact we want to have on our organization? Before we write it, why are we writing it, right? By having this policy, our organization will be able to respond and engage with the community in real time in a way that's authentic to itself, that's human and makes people connect with us as we connect with them. It's very different than our organization will be seen as a professional thought leader that is a standard for others to follow in this space, and that this community can trust at large. I just saw a great post, but it'll take me a second to read it. It's a bigger one. So Connie, I'm going to leave that one till later if that's okay. And we'll go from there. So the rules. Write a description outlining your policy. Don't worry about writing the policy, write the description. Write out the steps, the rules for people that they need to follow. What does that mean? The first job of a first draft, this has become my motto recently, is to exist. I hear this a lot of like, I don't know how to write the policy. I don't know where to start. Just start. It's a first draft. It's not the perfect thing. Write it. Write down the values that you clarified. Write down the intent. Write down what you think needs to happen. And once you've done that, it's much easier to write the policy. And now it's much easier to say, is it still future focused? Is it still that positive intent focused? Is it going where we want to go? Make sure you write down clear definitions, right? Are there any details that you need to make? But so the policy is consistent. We talked about that. When does it take effect? So does this policy start today? Since communications policy, is it in effect the minute we approve it, or does it come to effect next year? That's one of my biggest pet peeves about bylaws, and we've had a lot of conversations with Service Alberta around it, is that your bylaws, when you submit them, because really I think bylaws are a form of policy, they're not in effect the minute your membership passes them. They're in effect the minute they've been received and accepted by Service Alberta. And so if you have a major bylaws change that changes your board members or your voting or notice, and Service Alberta has a backlog, so let's say they don't get to it for 3 months, the minute they stamp it, all of a sudden everything has to change. And what we'd really like to do is see a time of saying, no, this policy needs a transition period. So this policy comes into effect 3 months from now, or 6 months from now, or 3 weeks from now. What does that look like? And when does it expire? It doesn't matter if you don't know the policy doesn't exist. It doesn't matter if you can't find the policy. If the policy is approved and has never been voided by the board, the policy's there. So, you know, my advice is make sure your policies expire and make sure you do a policy audit from that space. Expire doesn't mean it can't be renewed, but expire means that we have time to look over it and to reflect on it. And we talked about enforcement. Does this policy need any special rules, or do we have a general statement somewhere about what happens if policies are broken? What happens if a board member breaks a policy, if members break a policy, if staff break a policy? A lot of bylaws talk about member not in good standing. What does that actually mean? And does that mean that policy enforcement is part of it? What is that space? All policies need to be a way to be enforced. If you don't have a mechanism for enforcement, then there's no point having a rule. It's a guideline. It's not a policy. And as I said, there's the general one versus this policy. There are times where we've made rules that need to be more stricter than others. But even enforcement has its own values frame. When somebody breaks a rule, when somebody breaks our organizational culture, when somebody acts in a way that they shouldn't, what is our belief when it comes to the values that drive our feelings on this? And it's really interesting. This one's really fascinating until the reality is put in front of us. So, do you believe enforcement is about justice? You did a wrong, you do your time, you're done your time, you move on. Is it about revenge? You know, an eye for an eye. You hurt me, therefore I must, right? You hurt the organization, therefore you must pay a penalty. Or is it about rehabilitation? When people make mistakes, is it about helping them learn and grow? Sana just posted revenge, just kidding. But what's really interesting is many of us say that until we're faced with a reality where it affects us. And there's two really hard examples that come to mind in the last 15 years. One was in the news a while ago, and I think actually it's a really good example, but it's one that can be often hard to share. The Humboldt Broncos crash. For the driver of the truck, we sit here for a second and go, what does it really mean? Because when you watch the case, one of the families came to the judge and said, we believe nothing should happen. He's paid his time, right? Like, he's remorsed, he's hurting, he's trying to learn. We don't need to go any further with this. And yet other families felt very opposite. They felt that their loss, he hasn't paid his time. It wasn't about rehabilitation and learning. It was about either justice or revenge. And this is one of those values that's really easy to say I'm one of them until it's about me. And I think that's true for all of them. And so it's a hard example to use because for many of us it hits close to home. But I think that's something to think about is when we think about enforcement and we think about all of our values and where it stands, it's not about picking the word that feels right now. It's about really understanding what does choice one mean versus choice two mean, and am I actually comfortable? And you've picked the right opposing ideas when you're actually uncomfortable with it. That feeling of tightness in your chest or that disagreement, or that is the sign that you're dealing with that dissonance. You've got two things that you want to say. You want to believe that you're for justice, or you want to believe that you're for rehabilitation. And yet, in this case, I'm not, and it's sitting with me. What does that mean? Or in this case, I'm not. What does that mean? That means we actually have a conversation space. That tension is what's important. And that's what we're looking for, because that's how we figure out who we truly are to kind of go and create something. In our boards and our nonprofits, it's a little bit easier. There's only so much I can do in the revenge space. I can fire you. I can make you kick you out as a member. The Societies Act, for those who are registered in the Societies Act, allows me to fine you $5, but it allows me to fine you. Right? There's that kind of space. Rehabilitation, education, training, things become clear. But I think that's the piece that we need to think about. And this is the one that we all avoid. The amount of times people want to write policies, but not talk about how we enforce them and what happens if you break them. It's almost everybody I've ever worked with doesn't want to talk about enforcement. They just want to talk about the rule and not about what comes afterwards. But we can't drive to become, the goal is we never have to enforce them, right? When we create policies in this space, it's not about what can be. It's not about what happens, it's about what we want and the state we want. And so what we're trying to do is create rules that don't cause us to have to depend in this space. It causes us to have rules that allow us to shape what we want to do. One example, before we get to questions, because I tried to leave time in there, is, and this is my favorite, and I talk about this one a lot for those of you who know me, is I was given an HR manual, an HR policy manual to overlook for an organization. And the very first part of the manual says, this HR policy manual was designed to help us recruit and retain the best talent in the sector. Great, good start. We want to have HR policies that make people want to be here and everything else. And after reading just a few pages, I ended up walking to the ED's office and saying, so who are you trying to fire? Because the manual wasn't created to help us retain and recruit the best talent in the sector. It was created to help us get rid of somebody who was a problem. And it shows. Every staff person who came after who read that manual felt it. And that's the nature of it. is that your policies really do give people an impression of who they are and how they belong and how you want them to behave in the organization. I'm going to move to questions. Up on the slide right now, we've got a few upcoming programs. For those of you, some of these are fully online, some of them are not. I am doing a policy writing workshop with ECBO, but it's in person in November. So feel free to check that out if you're local, where we actually will take a lot more of a deeper dive and walk through things. But in the meantime, I'm here to answer questions and help. There's a lot.
Yeah, and towards that end, David, we'll ask if people could put if you have a question, please put it in the chat box, or if you would like to ask the question directly, you can also ask to be unmuted, and we can do it that way as well. But I do want to say that thank you, David, for for wonderful presentation. But one of the questions that I did see, and so yes, make sure as I'm saying this, put your questions in the chat box as I'm going here. A couple of ones that we picked up along the way. One was somebody asked a question. Samson said, "Can we look at guidelines versus black and white policy?" What's your thoughts around that, David?
I think a guideline is a policy, and that's okay, right? So, I would say my answer would be is that in some ways a budget is a policy, right? The budget approved by the board is the policy for how we're directing the organization to spend money throughout the next year, and it's not set in stone. I have seen organizations where this is how much you spend on photocopying, and this is how much you spend on printing, and are very detailed, versus something broader. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's about making sure that the guidelines are right to support your people in the way they need to be supported. And so it's great if it's the right fit, it's the right fit, and it's about adjusting it.
Okay. Connie mentioned, conversations, with boards and such that can be very, very difficult. Our groups include communication professionals, I think she's saying pros. So we had to develop a program along with professionalizing staff, doing so with some very broad policy directives from board meetings and not necessarily written down formally. Part of that was because we as a board felt we needed to be able to refine the program through trial and error. I think just more of a statement that's sort of adding to some of the thoughts you had there, Dave. Anything you want to add to that thought?
I think I saw that when it was really big, and so I stepped over it for a little bit. So I think when you created something like policy directives, and part of the statement was, we didn't codify them, right? Like we kind of have these bigger pieces, but we never have written them down formally. If you've never written them down formally, then they don't exist. And what I mean by that is your board will change, your staff will change, and that's going to be forgotten. And so you don't need to write it down in this structured, detailed template. I know I included a template in the slides. That template might not be right for you. I'm happy for you to throw out that template. I want you to use a template that makes sense for you and your organization. But if you don't codify it some way, even to say this is our vision statement when it comes to not organizations, but when it comes to policies, comms policies, this is the kind of thing we're trying to have without all the formality, that's fine. It gives me some direction when it's the next morning. We have this thing where we're paralyzed because the idea of a policy manual is huge and stressful, and we don't have these things. So what am I going to do, right? What do I need to, can my organization not do anything until all my policies are made? And the answer to that is no, we still need to operate, we still need to exist. What we can do is create statements that help us make decisions in the absence of policies. And really, from my mind, a clear vision, mission, and value statement is exactly that. We know the world we want to create. As long as what you're doing helps us go in that direction, right? We know our role in creating the world, that's our mission. As long as you're working within that space, fantastic. And we know our 5 guiding values. These are our 5 values that we as an organization don't compromise on. As long as you're not contravening any of those values, then you're good. And that buys us time to do the more detail that we need to do on things. So don't get paralyzed by it, but codify it. Codify it so that the next person knows, and codify it so that we're clear about it.
But sure, was this the one you picked up? What are some policies that all organizations should have from Amy? Some thoughts around there?
What are some policies that all organizations should have? That's a tough one. It's one of those of what I used to be Years ago, I used to say that everybody needs to have like a communications media policy, they're talking to the media or that. And I've become much more relaxed in that because I've moved up to this space of, like I was just saying, the vision, mission, values. And as long as we're working in that, that's what everybody should have. So we have clarity. We know what we stand for. And then from there, it's about sitting back and saying, where do we have the ability to create as we create, and what's our timeline? What I think a lot of boards are missing, and I think as the world has changed and the role of an executive committee has changed, where we all have cell phones. It's not 1930 where the barn is on fire and I need to get the board to vote on something and I can't reach them, but I can reach the executive. I can reach the whole board. And so the role of an executive has changed. What I'd like to see them do is become project managers on their governance. I'd like to see them lead their governance space. I'd like to see them think about what's our timeline for policies, what do we need to do, and then from there prioritize. And so what I would tell you is that's really the first step, is figuring out what guidance your staff need and your board needs first. Don't listen to me, who's an outsider.
All right. There was one from Lynn here, that came directly to me, saying good policy, then an operational manual. I'm not quite sure the context there, but I think that is there policies and what you can connection to an operational policy manual. I think there's some thinking around that. I think others might be interested in some of what your thoughts around there.
Yeah, I think there was a time where we said, you've got your bylaws, you've got your policies, and then you've got your procedures or operational manual. If you are a $10 million nonprofit that has HR staff and somebody who says policy, like somebody in those spaces, and you need all those pieces, it's a different conversation than if you're a small nonprofit operating on $150,000 a year, and you're desperate to just create your policies, let alone everything else in that system, right? And so to me, it's creating the depth that you need and the right people guiding that down. So from a board level, I want clean, simple, directive policies. But rather than creating one manual and then another, there's nothing wrong with saying, here's the board's direction on these frameworks, and here's how we execute them from a staff level, which is more procedural. We don't actually have to have them in two different places. We just have two different responsibilities of who's responsible for them. And it's about doing what you need to do at the level you need to do for your organization to operate and stay healthy. So if you don't need to get into the details and create that operational manual, then don't. But if you do, then you do. And so it's about the organization that you're with, right? If you're a food bank and you need to have very clear guidelines on how we handle food versus our food safety policy, then that's the clarity that we need to build in it.
Okay, thank you, David. One more question here is do you have ideas on how conflict resolution policy could be appreciative, right to the heart of the presentation?
Yeah, I think this is an awesome question because so many groups don't have a conflict management policy to begin with. I use the word conflict management rather than resolution. Resolution is about solving your conflict. It's about coming to a resolution from it. Management is about allowing your conflict, managing it so that we can keep it healthy. Innovation, ideas, problem solving come from conflict. And so I don't want to resolve all conflict, but I want to make sure that I have good conflict. From that, though, the question is, how do I make it appreciative? Well, let's flip the narrative and say, how do I want people to disagree and to collaborate and to innovate in my space? And so I think there's a nuance here. Is this a conflict management policy because we're a sports organization and two players, one's accusing the other of a racist slur on the ice? Sorry, that went a little close to home and from past experience. So that's very different than, my staff have tension and I need policies for how do we bring in a mediator? What does that mean? I think that there's an opportunity here to step back and say, what is good conflict in our office? What kind of conflict do we have? How do we keep it healthy? What kind of things allow for healthy conflict versus unhealthy conflict? And how do we create those kind of environments where people can talk? It's probably one of the hardest appreciative policies to create because it's a cultural shift. It's about creating a space where conflict is healthy and we embrace and engage in it. But I don't know the organization well enough to have that specific conversation, but it's about that. What do we need to allow for those things to happen? And how do we not run away from conflict let's be honest, most interpersonal conflict, which is where we really need those resolution policies, are usually misunderstandings between people. Whereas the type of conflicts we want to have in our workplace, and I should stop because I'll go into a full level lecture, are things like process and task conflict, how we do things and what we're doing. And that's a good thing. Our staff disagree because they see the world differently and how to solve the problems they're dealing with. How do we create spaces for that facilitated dialogue to happen? Rather than you and I have been fighting so long that we don't even know why we hate each other anymore, we just hate each other. And that's much farther down the line. And at that point, just get a mediator. We don't want to get there.
That's our end of our time now for questions for David. Thank you for your thoughts around that. The good news is, and I do see your question they have, Julia, we do have a plan here. David has agreed to stay on for a few minutes even after. We're going to close the formal part of the session now, because I know many of you have to go at 1. But if for Julia and others that still have a question for David, we're just going to take a minute or two to close the session and then just stay on, and then we'll come in and ask your question after others have been able to leave. So yes, with that, keep that in mind. So I'm going to formally close the session right now. And so on behalf of Board Leadership Alberta and all the participants today, I'd like to thank you, David, so much for sharing your insights and thoughts. By the comments in the chat box, and is well received. I think your information, your insights, learnings, ideas that we need to keep in mind. You made us really think when it comes to creating policy, some of the things that we really need to think of before we even begin. Where's our starting point with this? So thank you so much for making us think. And I think it was really good. You gave us a ton of information that'll be very valuable. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us as part of this Lunch and Learn series, David. Really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Scott, just quickly to add, for those, I do a governance ask your questions session about once every 2 months. So if that's a chance, I know, Garrett, if you had additional questions and you wanted to do a deeper dive, it's a much smaller audience. It's whatever people bring into the room. And so I'm happy to continue the conversation if people have questions. Okay,
that sounds good. Certainly, I encourage everybody to join David in that if you want to get, like you said, David, a deeper dive with that. We're going to have a link we're going to put in the chat box right now. We'd love to just get your thoughts, your experience with the session today. This really helps us guide future Board Leadership Alberta sessions that we want to have. So if you don't mind clicking on the evaluation form that's in the chat box right now, it's just a simple 1-page form to complete, and then there's at the bottom of the page you can simply click on the submit button to get it to us. And this is really help us, for even because one of the questions in there, what are some ideas and topic areas for future sessions that you have. So really would like to get your feedback there, because this does, even the sessions we have this year came from your suggestions from last year. Also want to mention, doesn't end today. We have one more Lunch and Learn session next week. Strategies for boards engaging in a changing environment. The registration link to register for that session, I'll put right in the chat box right now. So if you do want to register for that session, we certainly highly recommend that you do. That would be wonderful. And we will then be able to see you again next week. Also, we want to give a shout out to Board Leadership Calgary. They've had they've had sessions like this, and last year, and they also do Board Leadership Calgary also has done many in-person sessions over the years as well. So on the screen, you can see the dates for their upcoming sessions, tentative topic areas, and how to register when registration opens in October. So we're also going to put the link for that Board Leadership Calgary in there as well. There's the link to register for Board Leadership Calgary. And one more, again, if anybody's also interested, again, just to make sure you want to get the toolkit from the session today, you can see the toolkit resource in the chat box right now as well. And so it's right there. And also I want to say in closing now, on behalf of the Board Leadership Alberta Committee, thank you everyone for taking the time to be with us for this Lunch and Learn today, our second Lunch and Learn session with Board Leadership Alberta. In the meantime, take care, stay healthy, have a great rest of your day and week. And goodbye, and hope you are able to join us again next Thursday at this time. And for those of you that still have a question for David, simply stay online. And in a couple of minutes, we'll start picking up those questions, including the one from Julia as well that I saw in the chat box. So hopefully you're able to stay on as well, Julia, and we'll begin with that question, and then hopefully others that are there as well that have stayed on, we'll pick up those too. So we'll give everybody right now a minute or two that have to go, and then we'll begin the questions right away after. And once again, for those of you that have remained on, it's just simply put your questions in the chat box, or if you do want to put your hand up, I can also try to see if I see you there as well, and we can do it that way. So I'm going to take the first question, David, that we had from Julia in the chat box, and I'm just going to. Do you have any suggestions on how to create a policy around how to handle complaints? Even maybe some templates related to that.
Julia, I'm assuming you're still with us. So if that's the case, can you tell me, is it, complaints between volunteers, staff from the outside about the organization? Can you give me a little bit more context?
Julia, there?
She said yes. I'm assuming she's typing. I don't know if she wants to unmute and if she can or not.
Yeah, you can unmute as well if you would like. I can.
Complaints from parents.
Complaints from patients, yeah.
Oh, patients. Okay.
Oh, why can't I? Okay.
So it's a complaint from the client about the organization. If it's about something the organization's doing, it's different than if it's about a person. It's one of those spaces where what I would do is really to have a conversation about the same kind of thing we went through, which is how do you want what kind of values do you want your patients to experience when they issue a complaint? What does that look like? So the same questions about transparency versus privacy exist in there. Getting it right versus getting it done. All of those pieces are still incredibly important because different organizations and different types of relationships are going to want to exist in that differently. So I don't believe there's a best answer. I believe that there's an answer that makes sense for your organization and what that means for you. You probably need to hold things like privacy at a higher standard, especially if it's about a staff person, than about transparency. And that makes complaint process always awkward. And then on top of that, there's the whole piece of how do I help you feel heard when I might not be able to talk to you, right? And how do I help my staff feel safe? Because complaints can be a tool and a weapon as well. And so all of those things become complicated. And I think there's almost two conversations to be had. What are the values for our patients when they make a complaint? How do we want them to feel? And what are the values for our staff? And how do we want them to feel and be in these kind of spaces? And now how do we find the middle ground? What does that look like? But then even from the AI lens, can we step back and say, how do we want people to feel within the organization? And how do we want them, what is the best path when they don't feel that way before it gets escalated to the complaint level or to a severe complaint where you feel like you need mediation or huge intervention? How do we become something like a learning organization where people feel comfortable giving feedback that's not negative? What could that look like? Do we want to be that or not? And so I think there's different ways of thinking about it. Is what's the alternative question? And so when I get a question like that, it's usually, I'm dealing with this right now and this is a problem I've got. Okay, let's deal with that one. How do we want it to exist in the future?
Okay. Have another question here from that I see on came directly to me. It says, Our organization has a small town, has a staff with very limited office organization training or experience. If we make policies too detailed, they are cumbersome to change. That's why I wonder if manual is must or useful, is what more might be a must or is useful, I think is what the participant's trying to say. What's some of your thoughts there, David?
I need to make a lot of assumptions on this one, so I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to assume that the legislative, like the board or whoever it is who makes policies, is slow on the changing process. And so that's why we're kind of having a conversation of policies versus manual. In my mind these days, they're all the same thing, just different ways of representing the same thing. So what do I mean by that? It might be that in some organizations, the board does it all, and it's just one giant document. In other cases, the board does their part, and then the staff do their others, and so forth. I like, for more complex organizations and those that have more staff, I like boards, especially when you trust your staff, that create more higher level oversight policies and less detailed how-to policies. So, you know, a food bank, for example, their board doesn't need to pass a policy about washing your hands before touching food. They only need to pass a policy that says we meet the food healthy standards that are established by Alberta Health and other regulatory bodies in our community. And that what that allows it to do is the staff to say, okay, however we do this as long as it meets that broader piece. And if there's a leadership team who then creates a manual within that gives guidance to staff, that's great, easy. And we can do that in that space. In other cases, it might be the opposite, where the board is saying, no, the liability on this is too high. We want to make sure that we've created very clear rules on what it is, and we want to have control over how it executes and how it moves forward. And so it's about making sure that your policies are right for your organization. That means at what level and at what level of control and everything that goes with it. So I have no problem with that. I think that's, you do what you need to do to make it work. Should policies be super easy to change? Not really. So my question is, why a manual, and what is it you're trying to create and why? What's the tension point? And is it about, there's a difference between policies and direction. So I have frontline staff that I need to tell them how to do things is different than I need to create rules within which they operate. And so it's about meeting the need that you have there. I hope I've answered.
Julia before mentions thanks. You heard your response to her question earlier. She said thanks for that. Yeah, and Lynn, also from the person that direct messaged me also said thanks a lot. That was very, very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see another question here right now anywhere, but and again, anybody that's still with us, please put your question, your thought in the chat box, or let us know. Put your hand up that you're interested in asking a question. But I do have a question for you, David, that maybe the others that are still on that might be interested in. In some organizations, I've certainly been a part of them, where the board membership changes frequently. I was part of a preschool group, and it was very much the board membership changed a lot, just inherently naturally, because your parents were the board members, and your child's no longer in the preschool, you're no longer the board member there. How do you make sure you keep that all the focus you mentioned before about being visionary versus reactionary, when you're only maybe seeing a couple years of time in front of you, where it really your child's in this example, the preschool, where you might be only seeing your time there, and maybe your only focus is there for that period of time, but how do you what are some things that you could do that maybe help make people think more broadly, widely, when you're in that situation on a board?
So this is one of those arguments that I always wish the people who ran for the school board as school board trustees were people who were planning to have children, or who had children who weren't in the school yet, because the timeline of their work is not for the kids that are already in the school, right? And I think that's one of the challenges we have when we create systems like the preschools, where a lot of them require, in order to be on the board, your child needs to be in the preschool. But my window of engagement then is incredibly small. And really, let's be honest, I'm there for reasons that are my own. My kids are here. And so my thinking isn't about tomorrow. And that's really the challenge. It's an incredibly difficult challenge. I tend to talk about them, and not that it's a negative, but there's that self-serving board versus community serving board. So the self-serving board is, I am on this board because I get benefit from this organization directly, and I have an interest in what that looks like. Community leagues fit into this category, preschools fit into this category, school councils fit into this, condo boards fit into this. And what happens is I don't make decisions about the organization, I make decisions about my benefit. And I've had to be in conversations where that board member is pushing for all the money in our sports program to go to the potential Olympic athletes and not to the community athletes because their child is in the Olympic stream. And that's hard. It makes you wonder about our recruitment process and why people are there and how do we change it. So one of the things I'd right away say is, well, what does the diversity look like on your board? And is there a reason that everybody who's on your board has a child in your program right now? Because if you don't have anybody holding that other lens, it's going to be really hard. And there's what stops us from having people who are planning to have children in that program. Why have we tied it directly to that self-serving nature of it? Because it creates a bias for us. But on top of that, I think there's some easy tools and tricks you can do. The simple act of acknowledging why everybody's there changes the conversation. So can you imagine that preschool board, if everybody at the beginning of the meeting had to remind everybody that where their child was in the preschool and who their child was? All of a sudden it's front and center. And so by doing that, I know now everybody's reminded that I have a bias, and having a bias is okay. Disclosing the bias changes the behavior around the bias as well. And it's easier to hold each other accountable about it. Having a decision-making tool that helps you walk you through, and Jen talked a little bit about those last time, to make sure we change our focus. To really talk about, one of the things I mentioned is, when does this policy come into effect? There are times where we need to pass a policy that works today, but for an organization like that, you might want to pass all your policies to come into effect for the next year rather than this year, when you don't need one that's immediate. And the reason for that is, now I'm thinking about a policy that's not about what my child is going through in this moment. And so by changing the timeline and by forcing a change on the timeline, all of a sudden my behavior has to change around it. The system's different and I work differently in it. The comment I would leave for people to think about, and this one has never left me, is there's no such thing as a dysfunctional system. And I struggled with that statement the first time I heard it. But part two of that is, the question is, who is the system functional for? And so, in the example you gave, Scott, it's, the system is functional for the parents addressing their children right now and trying to, they're stepping out of space and trying to control the staff and the environment for their child. And what can we do to change the system so it no longer functions in that benefit? And there's many, many ways we can kind of challenge and approach that.
Yeah, thank you, David. That was really helpful. So I like the idea that the acknowledgement too of the situation, even too, together as a board, where we are, but also the other considerations that you give. One final question, I think we'll before we lose you today, the great opportunity that we've had for you to share your thoughts, your ideas, your learnings. Connie has a question. Should policy cover both board members, volunteers, and staff, or should there be a fairly distinct separation between a policy that covers volunteer board members and contacts that govern staff, that covers volunteers, board members, and contracts that governs, and contracts that govern staff? I'm not saying that one very well, sorry. What's your thoughts around that? Policy covering both board members, volunteers, and staff, or should there be a fairly distinct separation between them?
Yes. and depends on the circumstance. So, I think that contracts are harder to change than policies. We had that question earlier about, should things need a manual if it's hard to change policies? There's the contracts that my staff have that outline certain pieces that are in the HR space. But in the policy piece about working relationships or communication policies or food safety or liability risks or whatever, is there a need for it to be different? And I think it depends on the organization. So let's say you're a hospital foundation, and so you're the volunteer center for the hospital. Your volunteers aren't allowed to do what the unionized staff are supposed to be doing, right? So there is a very distinct difference there from a larger scale. Now, you don't employ the staff, you just bring in the volunteers, but there's need for things to be different. You know, and some of those volunteer centers are actually run by the hospital. So yeah, you have policies that are directly about the volunteers in the hospital that are very different than the staff. But there are other spaces where no, like our communications and talking to the media policy is for everybody. The only person in our organization who can talk to the media without permission from the board is the executive director, and only on these topics, right? So that applies to everybody, doesn't matter. And so I think it's very much specific. I think you'll find that almost all cases, something that applies to the volunteers applies to the staff if they're working in the same space, except when it comes to certain things like risk management and liability. And that really, if your policies are written right, you want that culture to be for everybody. It's more about the work they're doing and their roles. It's different. But I think you'll find that, you know, our communications policies, if a volunteer is writing our newsletter, I want them following the same policies that a board member should be doing if that's the case. And, you know, if a volunteer is interacting with vulnerable populations, they should be following the same rules. I think there's often been a trend to do things like call volunteers unpaid staff, which changes the level of professionalism. So in that case, yes. So, but it really is dependent on your organization and your needs and why. Why is there a difference?
All right. Thank you, David. That ends our time, folks, everybody today. Thank you for those of you that have stayed on after. I think we've, again, those questions were all really, really good. And I think, again, added to our understanding, certainly by the comments in the chat box, David, they're all, again, your thoughts are well received. So that's it, folks, for now. I'm going to ask David just to stay on for a minute or two, even after, just final words with each other, but on you know, going forward. But thank you again, David, for your time, for even taking the time, this extra time with everybody here that we've had this wonderful last 20 minutes or so that we've had even after the session was over. Thank you so much for that. So, all right, thank you again, everybody that's here. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll hopefully see you at next week's final Lunch and Learn. Take care.